So, we have discovered animals and plants depicted in cathedrals, some of which hold allegorical meaning while others seemingly do not. We have found images representing the months of the calendar, zodiac signs, and agricultural activities. We have encountered allegories of sciences and arts, virtues and vices. Truly, cathedrals are enormous stone books, vast encyclopedias that encompass various aspects of human knowledge of that time. However, above all, a cathedral is a place of worship. Therefore, its most important message is that of a religious character. So now, let us move on to perhaps the most intriguing aspect: the figures of prophets and saints that one can encounter within cathedrals. Let's take a moment to recall the design of the portal of the cathedral. Well, portal is a fancy word for an entrance. So it has a door, and in the middle of it there is a so-called tympanum. That is to say, a massive stone pillar. Usually you will find a sculpture of Christ or the Virgin Mary or the most revered local saint there. And there are also sculptures on the sides of the doors. There we usually discover various saints, although identifying them is not a simple task. How can we identify them? Well, naturally, through their attributes. I want to make an important point here. In Gothic art, attributes can be found either in the hands of the saints, such as objects they hold, their clothing, or some other detail, or in the consoles. Just to remind you, all the sculptures stand on those small shelves called consoles. And very often those consoles are adorned with figurines, and those figures within the consoles often provide us with clues about who is before us. As we continue our lecture, we will repeatedly come back to those consoles. Naturally, the most important characters are usually found on the sides of the doors of the central portal. Typically, we will see sculptures of the Old Testament prophets and kings there, and they are not chosen randomly. Usually, they also represent types of Christ. That is to say, those are Old Testament characters symbolically paralleled to Christ. We have actually talked quite a lot about types, and I sincerely hope you remember that. But I want to point out that the creation of types and establishing correspondence between Old Testament and New Testament figures often involved a considerable amount of artistic interpretation and imagination. Let me give you an example. A rather lengthy passage that I will read to, and I'm sorry for it being too long, but it is necessary. It is from Saint Augustine. He writes about David and Goliath. You surely remember the story. The young boy David, armed with a sling, slays the enormous Goliath. And here is how Augustine analyzes this episode from the Bible. He says, "The devil is embodied by Goliath, while on the other hand, Jesus Christ, whose image is David. David took 5 stones from the brook and put them in a vessel that served him for sheep's milk, and thus armed, he went forth to meet his enemy. David's 5 stones signify the 5 books of Moses' law, and indeed the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses, is the foundational part of the Old Testament." And then Augustine continues, "The law, in turn, contains within it the 10 commandments, from which all else flows. Therefore, the law is signified by both the number 5 and the number 10. Hence, David fights with 5 stones and plays, as they say, on a 10-stringed instrument. And notice, continues Augustine, that he does not throw all 5 stones, but only one. This solitary stone symbolizes that which fulfills the law, namely merciful love. And further, note that he took 5 stones from the brook. And what is a brook? Are they not people, light and fleeting, whom cruel passions draw into the sea of vanity? And indeed, this is what the Jewish people were like. They received the law, but passed over it like a brook flows over stones. However, our Lord took the law to elevate it to grace, just as David took the stones from the brook and placed them in the vessel for milk. And what better represents grace than the abundant sweetness of milk? As you can see, the parallels drawn by Augustine are beautiful but entirely arbitrary. Those individuals endowed with eloquence and rich imagination can generate endless explanations of this sort, which is exactly what medieval theologians did. However, during the High Middle Ages, a relatively stable set of main types emerged, and those were most frequently reproduced. Those types are listed in the book by Honorius of Autun, that's his name and the town of his birth. As we mentioned before in a different lecture, so we can be reasonably confident in our interpretations. Let's take a look at perhaps the most known example. So, the classic example is the cathedral in Chartres, in France, specifically the central portal. The sculptures start from the left to the right. The figure on the far left is Melchizedek. Remember, we already mentioned him in the lecture on the Ravenna mosaics. He appeared there together with Abraham and Abel, who was innocently killed by Cain. Melchizedek is only mentioned once in the Bible. As stated in the text, he was a certain high priest who meets Abraham and offers him bread and wine. Naturally, on a symbolic level, this was understood as a foreshadowing of the Eucharist and, in turn, Christ's sacrificial death on the cross. For Eucharist is the symbolic representation of Christ's sacrificial death on the cross. So Melchizedek here is holding a cup, which is precisely the cup with wine. Next to him is Abraham. Abraham is very easy to recognize because he is holding his son Isaac, whom, as you recall, God commanded him to sacrifice, but at the last moment his command was revoked. It is clear that the sacrifice of Isaac was associated with Christ's sacrificial death on the cross as well, and I think further comments are unnecessary in this case. Next up is Moses on the far right. Now, Moses is also easy to recognize. First, he is holding the tablets with 10 commandments on them. And those are usually depicted as 2 stone tablets rounded on top. Secondly, take a look. Next to him is a Gothic column, and on top of the column there is a little dragon. Well, this is an image of a bronze serpent. Well, a medieval version of the bronze serpent. I believe we have already discussed that the bronze serpent was also understood as a type of Christ. I mean, think about it. The bronze serpent was elevated on a pole, just like Christ was elevated on the cross. The bronze serpent saved people from physical death and snake bites, while Christ redeems sins and saves people from hell and eternal death. Therefore, Moses with the bronze serpent also foreshadows and prefigures Christ. The next 2 sculptures are Samuel and David. Samuel was the high priest in Israel, and he has anointed David as the king. Here he is depicted performing a sacrifice, since he was a high priest. And you see, he has a lamb, and he approaches it with a knife. Naturally, any Old Testament sacrifice was always associated with the sacrifice of Christ. And in this sense, Samuel also anticipates Christ. He is one of his types. As for David, take a look. He is holding a spear in one hand, and in the other hand there was clearly something, but it has not survived. However, that particular object is well preserved in another sculpture in a different cathedral. And in the next illustration you can clearly see that he was holding a crown of thorns. Okay. As you understand, both the spear and the crown are instruments of passions, the tools used during their execution of Christ. There are other instruments of passions as well, such as the nails, the cross itself, the whipping pole, the whips and the rods, and so on. But the spear that has pierced his side and the crown of thorns are perhaps the most prominent and recognizable. So, why is David depicted with them? Well, besides being a king of Israel, David was also a songwriter or psalmist. He was attributed authorship of almost all the psalms in the Bible, and many of those contain depictions that were perceived as foreshadowing the sufferings of Christ on the cross. Wow, that was a long sentence. I'm sorry about it. Let me give you a concrete example. So, a famous Psalm number 22. Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. It is very powerful and dramatic, and those descriptions of suffering were always perceived as alluding to Christ's sufferings on the cross. And that is why David is always depicted with the crown of thorns, the symbol of those sufferings. Now, let's take a look at the consoles of similar sculptures in Lyon, also in France. They can tell us a lot. Okay. On the far left, next to Isaac, we have a ram in the console. That's naturally the ram that appears after the angel stops Abraham's hand with a knife at the last moment, canceling the sacrifice of Isaac. The angel, as you might recall, the angel then tells Abraham, "Here is your sacrifice." And miraculously, they find the ram tied up in the bushes. Next to Moses, interestingly, we have another ram. Well, technically it's not a ram, but a calf. It's the golden calf. As you may recall, when Moses goes up to Mountain Sinai to communicate with God, the Israelites start worshipping the golden calf, and later Moses destroys it. So it's a reference to that biblical story. As you can see, usually figures in the consoles represent episodes associated with each character. The same rule applies to David. He has a lion at his feet. And we usually associate lion with Samson, who, as you recall, tears apart a lion's jaw. However, in the Bible there is also a story about David in his youth when he was a shepherd. Once a lion attacked his flock, and David has personally killed it. So, the lion is a reference to a specific episode from his biography. Now, let's return to shutters. We have just looked at the left side of the main doors, and now let's turn our attention to the right side. There are 5 more figures there. The one on the far left is the prophet Isaiah. he can be unmistakably identified. And do you know how? Well, take a look. He is standing on a figure of a sleeping man with a long beard, and on Isaiah's chest you can see what appears to be a flower, as if there was a stem there, but it has broken off. I believe you can already guess what it represents. Well, maybe not really, for the answer to this question is in the remaining part of this lecture. But in any case, hopefully this small sample has already helped you to make more sense of this bizarre world of medieval imaginary. And if now you finally decide to take that trip to Europe, which you have been probably dreaming of for many years, you will not be completely lost if you go to a Gothic cathedral. However, if you want more medieval fun of this kind, I strongly encourage you to take a look at my course of lectures, The First Acquaintance. Because in that course you will find, among other things, the full version of this lecture on Gothic imagery. And trust me, within that lecture there is more information about Gothic art than any random person has ever cared to know. However, you are not that random, I assume. Since you have watched this, I'm sure you are interested in the matter, so if that's the case, why not take a further step towards your hobby, towards your interest? So, there is a link somewhere around me. Find it, click it, tap it, whatever. Enroll. I mean, it costs less than $10. There is a full money-back guarantee. I'm not even supposed to convince you to do it that much. So, please, take a chance, enroll, and hopefully I will see you inside with more information about this intriguing world of medieval art.